E bisogna poi spegnerlo dopo che ha parlato perché automaticamente dalla telecamera lo speech.
Buongiorno, buongiorno a tutti. Buongiorno. Vi chiederei di prendere posto, grazie. Take your seat, please. Bene, possiamo iniziare, grazie. Bene, buongiorno, buongiorno a tutti. Vi pregherei di prendere posto, grazie. È un grande onore aprire i lavori di questo convegno organizzato assieme ai colleghi del direttivo per celebrare i 25 anni dell'Associazione Italiana Professori di Diritto Amministrativo. Ringrazio molto il Presidente Brunetta per aver concesso all'AIPDA di festeggiare questa importante ricorrenza in una sede istituzionale prestigiosa, quella del CNEL, il Consiglio Nazionale dell'Economia e del Lavoro, in uno tra i palazzi di maggior fascino della capitale. Il Presidente Brunetta purtroppo non potrà tenere i saluti introduttivi perché è chiamato in Parlamento e mi scrive la seguente lettera. Caro Aldo, è con sincero rammarico che devo comunicarti l'impossibilità di partecipare all'evento previsto al CNEL per il sopraggiungere di improrogabili impegni istituzionali. L'iniziativa sarà di certo l'occasione per un importante momento di riflessione su un tema di così grande rilevanza qual è la prospettiva europea e l'evoluzione nazionale nella formazione del diritto amministrativo. Sono particolarmente lieto che l'associazione AIPDA che presiedi abbia scelto il CNEL quale sede dell'incontro promosso per celebrare il 25° anniversario della sua fondazione. Le attività curate dall'associazione, con particolare riguardo alle questioni rilevanti del diritto amministrativo, anche in un'ottica comparata e con un ampio coinvolgimento delle principali università italiane e europee, sono in sintonia con il CNEL, con la sua missione, con i compiti istitutivi affidati dai padri costituenti, Il CNEL è infatti il luogo del dialogo costante tra le rappresentanze sindacali, datoriali e del volontariato, ma anche dell'accademia e delle eccellenze scientifiche e culturali del Paese. Ben vengano dunque iniziative come quella promossa dall'Associazione Italiana Professori di Diritto Amministrativo. La nostra casa è la vostra casa. Porta cortesemente i miei saluti a tutti gli illustri partecipanti e auguro a tutti voi buon lavoro. Quindi ringrazio molto il Presidente per l'ospitalità e ringrazio i prestigiosi colleghi di importanti università europee ed italiane che hanno accolto il nostro invito a essere relatori e ospiti. E purtroppo il professor Eberhard Schmid-Hassmann non potrà essere con noi oggi per problemi di salute, ma ha fatto pervenire la sua relazione e la professoressa Diana Urania Galetta ne darà lettura. Ringrazio anche i colleghi che sono presenti oggi in questa aula molto bella del Parlamentino e i tanti che sono collegati in streaming e ringrazio le case editrici Giappichelli ed Editoriale Scientifica per il supporto che hanno dato all'evento. Infine permettetemi di ringraziare la dottoressa Elisabetta Tati e gli altri giovani studiosi che ci hanno dato una mano, senza i quali sarebbe stato impossibile organizzare l'evento odierno. E vorrei anche ringraziare molto il consigliere Alessandro Vaccari del CNEL per il grande aiuto assicurato e il personale del CNEL tutto. Ringrazio in ultimo i professori Sabino Cassese e Giacinto della Cananea, Lorenzo Casini, Martina Conticelli e la direttrice della Galleria Borghese Francesca Cappelletti per l'ausilio fornitoci. Vi segnalo che sono disponibili le apparecchiature per la traduzione simultanea e ringrazio molto da questo punto di vista la Scuola di Interpretariato dell'Università Internazionale di Roma per la fattiva collaborazione. I'm now switching to English to analyze the main contents of today's conference. But first, I would like to share a few thoughts on the importance of celebrating the association's 25th anniversary and why we should take pride in this achievement. First of all, the Italian administrative law community is united and active around our association, which is the only one of its kind in Italy. The fact that we maintain our unity is very important, especially considering that other scientific fields are divided into several associations. The harmony of a scientific community is essential for maintaining scientific vitality, fostering open and fruitful debate, and supporting the steady growth of young scholars. Secondly, the association has approximately 200 members who are full professors of administrative law, either currently active or retired. Over 700 young colleagues are drawn to the association, and this demonstrates the vitality of our administrative law in our country. Thirdly, the association maintains strong international connection with a similar organization in Europe and beyond, encouraging legal comparison and the study of administration at both the global and European levels. Lastly, the association aims to make a meaningful contribution to national level institutional debates on legislative proposal for administrative reform and to participate actively in academic and scientific research settings. In the few minutes remaining, I would like to say a few words about the structures of today's conference. First of all, why is it important to reflect on the history of administrative law? At a time of great change, when the constitutional foundations of the rule of law and the democratic constitutional state are being called into question, and when even in countries with long-standing constitutional and democratic traditions, voices advocate setting aside the administrative state in favor of a strong executive that leaves no room for administrative decision-making, it becomes essential to return to the roots of administrative law, both in Europe and in Italy. This return is necessary in order to define the proper scope of administrative action and the functions that properly fall within its remit, and to reconsider the safeguards available to citizens, not only vis-à-vis public authorities, but also private actors. The first session focuses on legal comparison, exploring the historical origins of administrative law. The idea originates from Paul Craig's recent book, English Administrative Law from 1550, Continuity and Change, which situates the emergence of administrative law in England during the latter half of the 16th century, and specifically distinguishes between reality and perception. He argues that what happens at the institutional and legislative levels is one thing, but what is perceived as a result of the spread of ideas is another. This distinction between reality and perception has led us to ask whether it is a similar gap between the actual course of administrative events and the theoretical frameworks developed by legal scholarship has emerged in the other major countries of continental Europe. However, it must also be borne in mind that reality and perception may intersect in different ways in the experiences of various legal systems. And the perception is also the moment when certainty and stability are achieved within a regulatory mechanism, as well as when the autonomy of academic knowledge is established within a given legal order. I am most grateful to Paul Craig for being here today, and this morning's panel includes some of the world's most distinguished scholars in administrative law. The panel will be chaired by Sabino Cassese, who was the first president of AIPDA at the beginning of 21st century. I'm confident that this will be a morning of great scholarly interest. The afternoon session will be devoted to the history of administrative law in Italy. We have chosen to take a broader view, opting not to confine our focus to the period of origins, but to undertake a historical analysis of administrative law based on its various formats, on its various components: legislation, administration, the courts, and legal scholarship. Admittedly, separating these elements is to some extent artificial. Nonetheless, it may be illuminating to trace the major turning point in the historical development of administrative law through the lens of the legislator, the courts, legal scholarship, and so forth. For this session too, we are fortunate to have a distinguished panel of speakers, starting with the chairman, Professor Franco Gaetano Scoca. Lastly, between the first and second sessions, there will be a brief interlude to reflect on the 25 years of AIPDA's history, during which the past presidents of the association will take the floor. I'm confident that it will be a highly productive day from the scholarly point of view. Warm congratulations to AIPDA on its 25th anniversary. The hope is for a long and flourishing future for the community of Italian scholars of administrative law, and we may gather again a quarter of a century from now to celebrate the association's 50th anniversary. I now leave the floor to Sabino Cassese and the first panel. Thank you very much. Arrivano.
Jack. Paul, where are you? Io vorrei dei cuscini. Delle sedie basse queste, sì. Well, welcome to this session of our conference. For the title of I have to introduce and then to chair this the session of this morning. And you may know that the British publisher Hart has just published a few weeks ago a new book. And I will borrow the title of that book for my presentation. The title of that book is The Making and Remaking of Public Law. So I want to address the point of making and remaking administrative law. And my introduction, I hope to be very short. My introduction will be focused. I will start with two quotations from Tocqueville and from Dicey. And then I will focus on the parallel developments of administrative law in England and in France. And then I will try to explain why, given the parallel developments, a doctrine has developed that we have two ways to administrative law. One is the British one, and the other one is the French one. So this is a kind of mysterious conclusion, and I will try to explain why this idea has developed. I start with the two long quotations from Tocqueville. In the first, so-called the first democracy in 1835, and at the end of chapter 6 of the first part of the first democracy, he wrote, I'm reading from the second translation in English, but when I tried to make, he's referring to the conversation between himself and the American interlocutors. But when I tried to make them understand that the Conseil d'État, the French Conseil d'État, was not a judicial body at all in the ordinary sense of the term, but an administrative body whose members were dependent on the king, and that the king, as a sovereign, after ordering one of his servants, called prefect, to commit a wrongful act, could order as sovereign another of his servant, called counselor of the council of the Conseil d'État, to prevent someone from having the first punished. He was referring to the Garantie des Fonctionnaires. They refused to believe in such enormities and accused me of lying and of ignorance, the Americans to Tocqueville. Now, I jump now to a dialogue in 70 years later. Now, this time is Albert van Dicey talking to Barthélemy, the French. When he gave to Professor Dicey, his Barthélemy, about 40 years ago, a copy of his Traité de droit administratif, Professor Dicey replied, in England, there is no droit administratif. We do not know what it can be, and smilingly added, we prefer not to know, as we are afraid of regulations which appear to be less guarantees for citizens than privileges for officials. Now, these two exchanges, the Americans talking to Tocqueville and Berthelemy talking to Dicey are the perfect introduction to a historical and comparative exploration of the development of administrative law in Europe. That is the subject of of this session. Now, I start by trying to explain why England and France had almost the same developments. Any investigation into this subject, that is the parallel developments of France and England, requires an historical comparative approach that draws together the trajectories of France and England, the two nations that were at that time Europe. Europe was just on one side England and on the other side France. If one were to consider separately the comparative history of administration, the norms, the body of law governing the public administration, the judiciary overseeing public administration, and legal thought that reflects upon it, what we call administrative law, the administrative law science, one might be tempted to believe that these four strands evolved in parallel in both France and England. Yet, while the first two did unfold along similar lines, the latter two followed divergent paths, and this divergence forms the focus of my analysis. Now, I start from the very beginning. During the 18th century, the two countries differed in scale. France, during that century, grew from 21 to 28 million inhabitants, while England population rose from 5 to 8 million. Nonetheless, both had developed complex administrative machineries. France had a sophisticated administrative machinery, and we know it because Tocqueville wrote the Ancien Régime et la Révolution, in which he demonstrates that the tradition of the Ancien Régime was a tradition developed by Napoleon, but there was continuity in the administration. And in his presentation at the Académie des Sciences Morales et Politiques of the famous Cours de droit administratif by Macquerel, he underlined the fact that Macquerel's presentation of French administrative law was based upon no fewer than 80,000 statutes and ordonnances. So there was a great body of law. England, on the other side, had begun as early as the 16th century to regulate domains as bankruptcy, taxation, water management, poor relief, local public services, urban planning, public health, trade, and industry. And if you read the seminal book written by Paul Craig, you know that I have summarized shortly his book, which is the major contribution to our field in the last few years. In the 18th century, it began to construct what would become the most extensive empire in history. At its height, I'm referring to the English empire, at its height, encompassing 1/5 of the world's population. So England had the domain and was governing 1/5 of the world's population. And although the England was ruling through the so-called indirect rule, it had broad and important functions entrusted to inspectorates and commissions. In terms of the civil service, France in 1873 counted some 285,000 public employees. So it was a large body of public employees arranged in a rigid hierarchy and chiefly engaged in education, postal services, finance, and colonial administration. England, by contrast, employed 20,000 civil servants in 1832, and this number had risen to 40,000 by 1851 and to 100,000 by 1871. So there was a quick rise of the British bureaucracy. In the two administrations, the English and the French, the principle of merit, the merit system, was affirmed in the middle of the 19th century. You may remember the North Coast Rebellion report in England, and you may know that some of the Tocqueville contribution by Tocqueville as a politician in the French chamber was on what he called la passion des places. La passion des places, that is the role played by members of the parliament who were in the meantime also fonctionnaires d'etat. In the overall development, there were differences. The French administration was centralized, the English was based on self-government. The English administration managed the colonies through indirect rule. The French administration followed the Napoleonic principles of uniformity and centralization. The French administration was subject to a special judges, the Conseil d'Etat, the English administration to the same ordinary judges to which private parties were subject. But my conclusion at this point is that these differences did not justify putting the two administrations each other against each other and constructing two divergent models, the French way to administrative law and the British way against administrative law, not co-administrative. How then to explain, and I go to my second point, how then to explain the widely held view that there exist two different models of legal system? One defined by the presence of a specific body of rules governing administration, and the other characterized by a single body of law applicable equally to both the private and public spheres. The claim that there was an administrative law in France and its denial in England may be accounted for by two converging explanations, and I will try to provide you this. The first lies in the broader historical backdrop, the history of two nations and two nationalisms. And the second concerns the mutual influence exerted by the two legal cultures. I begin now with the first explanation. And I begin with the hypothesis that two nations are historically, if two nations are historically opposed in long-standing conflicts, it is likely that their legal thought will reflect that opposition, seeking difference in legal models rather than similarity. Now, if you take into account the history of France and England, you can consider that there was a war that lasted 100 years, more than 100 years. It lasted 116 years between the two because of the England's claim to the French crown. But you can also consider that according to the famous French historian Lucien Febvre, in the late 17th century, I quote, "It is France that reigns, that dominates, that triumphs." So the two, England and France, they were opposing, just like China and the US now, just the same way. A second reason is the divergence in the two great revolutions. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 in England, a bloodless constitutional new settlement on one side, and the other one, the 1789 French Revolution. And this contrast was highlighted by Burke in England and by Guizot in France. Thus, England and France faced each other, scrutinizing and judging one another, much as the United States and China today. Meanwhile, England gained command of the seas and built a vast colonial empire, while France struggled with its own expansionist ambitions. You may know the reports done by Tocqueville in the two journeys that he made to Algiers, and you may know the problems faced by France in establishing a colonial empire similar to the English Empire. Thus, alongside the common development of administrative structures in both countries, there stands a deeper opposition, in a position born of divergent historical experiences and cultural trajectories. I now go to my third point, that is the second explanation. Now, beside the centuries-long rivalry between the two major hegemonic powers of European history lies another dimension, that is their intellectual histories, and in particular, the dialogue between, of course, Tocqueville and Dicey. The reaction to the American interlocutors that I mentioned at the very beginning became the cause of Dicey's rejection of the French model of administrative law, which he perceived as an illiberal construct. In doing so, Dicey committed what he himself would later call a fundamental mistake. Now, I turn to history again because to grasp the roots of this mistake, the misunderstanding between the British culture and French culture, you must take into account that people like Voltaire wrote in 1733 that London was a modern day Rome. The English esteem was great for the liberties of England, and also the authority of the House of Commons was object of admiration. So French culture admired English culture. One of the most important chapters of the L'Esprit de Loi of Montesquieu is called De la Constitution d'Angleterre. And this is also, again, a model. And if you read the works written by the well-known historian and politician François Guizot, you will see that he and then his followers, Taine and Boutmy, they were the admirers of England. And take into account that Boutmy was the founder of the École Libre des Sciences Politiques, that later became the Institut d'études politiques, the famous Sciences Po, was established by Boutmy, so by an admirer of the English system. It is upon this cultural backdrop that the Tocqueville-Dicey relations relationship unfolds. In 1885, in his introduction to the study of the law of the Constitution, Dicey wrote, I quote, "The nature and the very existence of administrative law has been revealed to many Englishmen, as certainly to the present writer, to himself, through the writings of Alexis de Tocqueville." So this was the real source of his conclusions. And Dicey was struck by the responses Tocqueville had received from the Americans that I quoted at the beginning, when describing French administrative justice and by Tocqueville's own criticism of that system. Consequently, Dicey denied that anything akin to droit administratif. I don't know if, Paul, you noticed that until a certain point of his life, Dicey never used in English administrative law. He referred to administrative law always in French, droit administratif, just to underline that it was foreign to the British, even the British language. You see, we don't know, and we don't want to know droit administratif is a famous sentence that he used with his French counterpart. Consequently, Dicey denied that anything akin to a droit administratif existed in England, and thus were formed, so to say, in contrasting fashion, the two great legal archetypes: countries governed by administrative law and countries ruled by common law. The idea of this divergence as developed by Dicey was inspired not only by nationalism, but also by French critiques of their own institutions. At the end of his travels in England, Tocqueville made two travels in England, 1833 and 1835. Tocqueville remarked that England was fortunate to be without a Conseil d'État, and in the notes from his second journey, he wrote, I quote, "The need to introduce judicial power into administration is one of those central ideas to which all my research on democracy and on the ancien regime, into what has enabled and may yet enable political liberty returns." And while presenting the famous Cours de droit administratif written by Mackerel in the Académie des sciences morales et politiques, Tocqueville described administrative law as a science both new and still highly contested, and the object of intense criticism. In the same report, that same day, he distinguished between two types of ordinary justice: one entrusted to independent judges, the other to special tribunals or the king himself. And he went on to argue that such practices amounted to a legal axioms which no free country, no civilized people will ever admit, for they represent a partial derogation from general law. And he added, true monstrosities. He concluded, if our administrative system was conceived by liberty, it was completed by despotism. And he added, 1,000 times I have had occasion to speak on this subject with the most enlightened men of America and England, and I have not met a single one who would wish to adopt for his own country the French administrative system, taken in its entirety and bearing the imprint of Napoleon's powerful hand, nor anyone who thought that such a system could long remain compatible with liberty. I now come to the conclusion. the title of this conclusion is From Divergence to Convergence. The reaction of Americans to Tocqueville's description of French institutions led him to suspect that administrative law was an illiberal instrument. This conclusion, in turn, deeply influenced Dicey, who rejected the very notion that administrative law could have any place within England, a country governed by the principle of equality and by the rule of law. Here we find a case in which legal systems evolved under the pressure of political and social necessity, shaped by the functional demands faced by two great powers, the two biggest powers in Europe at that time, England and France, yet were interpreted and constructed through idées reçues, received ideas themselves influenced by developments occurring elsewhere. The opposition of the French liberals to the Bonapartist style liberalism convinced the English observers that the French regime was not liberal at all. And this regime was identified with droit administratif, and thus the latter came to be viewed as inherently illiberal. English legal culture, seeking to distinguish itself, emphasized its own distinctiveness and denied the existence of the droit administratif, the administrative law, on its soil. So the idea was born on a French root, grew into an English trunk, and later branched outward to other traditions. Now, this contrast, which takes together the history of the real administration and the administrative law and the scholarship of administrative law, has for 2 centuries obscured the similarities. And it is important, the book written by Paul Craig, because he demonstrates that the administrative law was there in England since 1550, so since many centuries. And this contrast has for 2 centuries obscured the similarities. Administrative law became a singularity of France, and of course, thereon of Italy and Spain, etc. However, this was useful because it acted as a myth, prompting administrative law countries to introduce elements of private law into their administrative systems, which thus became less authoritarian. So now we have a question that I can try to express through the title of a short contribution written by one of our French colleagues. I don't know if he's here, Thomas Perroux, who wrote in 21 a short blog whose title is Le droit privé est-il l'avenir du droit public? ? Thank you very much. I think that's it is soon, no? Yeah, you're the first speaker. Yeah, thank you very much. I don't know.
Peter, thank you very much indeed. It is a great pleasure to be here today and to participate in this interesting and important conference. Administrative law. Special thanks to Professor Aldo Sanduli for organizing the conference and for having brought together a great group of scholars for this occasion. I'm reminded every time I come to your wonderful country how rich your intellectual and scholarly traditions are, none more so than in the field of public law and administrative law. You are truly blessed in having a wonderful group of scholars and producing a wonderful group of publications and scholarship accordingly. Just by way of introduction, I would just like to add a further testimony to our chair today. Sabino Cassese is an amazing scholar. He is someone I have looked up to and learned from for 45 or 50 years, a very long time. His vigor and vitality are amazing. And as I was saying to Jacques Ziller over dinner last night, we, Jacques and I, are merely a sprightly 73 years old, and it's nice to know that we are, by way of comparison to Sabino, merely in the middle age of scholarship, not in the old age. Sabino, you are amazing. Thank you very much for that really stimulating introduction. I'm here today to say something about the history of administrative law in the UK, a topic which until recently would have been viewed with some skepticism. I have been told to speak for 30 minutes. I will speak for 30 minutes, and the presentation will be divided into two broad halves. The first half is going to relate something about the origins of administrative law in terms of regulation and the administrative landscape. And then the second half is going to talk about judicial review and doctrine and courts and the common law tradition. And I'll also pick up on some of the themes that Sabino just spoke about. So on part one then, about the regulatory and administrative framework. The commonly held view, as Aldo indicated in his introduction about administrative law, is that it is of recent origin, some dating it from the mid-20th century, some daring to go back to the late 19th century. And that view was powerfully expressed by Dicey. That view, when unpacked, is premised on assumptions concerning doctrinal case law and regulation. There is an empirical and a normative foundation underlying both assumptions. That intellectual package constitutes the commonly perceived or accepted view of administrative law as it unfolded in England. That then is perception, grounded in four central constructs concerning case law and regulation, viewed both from an empirical and normative perspective. Put briefly, the empirical dimension of the perceived view was based on the assumption that there was scant case law concerning administrative law because there was little by way of regulatory legislation giving power to administrators. The commonly held view is wrong and badly so. It does not accord with the reality concerning case law or regulation, nor do the normative assumptions underlying the perceived view square with the general approach of the courts or the legislature during the foundational period of administrative law, which ran from the 16th century, mid-16th century onwards, with earlier origins. There was, in reality, a very considerable amount of case law concerning judicial review, and it existed because there was a very considerable volume of regulatory legislation, the administration of which generated the disputes that gave rise to administrative law doctrine. The courts developed many of the central concepts of judicial review with which we are familiar today. There is then a proximate connection between state regulatory activity and the emergence of judicial review, or certainly there is and was in the UK. The latter, judicial review, emerges because of alleged errors and actual errors made pursuant to the exercise of regulatory power by the administration. The mistake in the standard account is therefore not conceptual, but temporal. It misses the temporal mark by 400 years. The reality was that there was a very great deal of regulation from the mid-16th century onwards, which was the catalyst for the emergence of the doctrinal and remedial principles of judicial review. The emergence of judicial review was not therefore fortuitous, it was not happenstance, it was driven by disputes that arose precisely because of state regulation coupled with administrative agencies, and the scope of both were very significant. I should emphasize at this juncture that the regulatory legislation granting power to the administration in the UK between 1550 and 1900 took the form of real statutes which were policed by real courts. We are blessed in the UK with having law reports which date back to the 12th century. We are also blessed in the UK with having databases on statutes that date from roughly the same period. Real statutes giving real administrative power to a plethora of administrative agencies policed by real courts. Digitalization at the turn of the last millennium has rendered this wonderful body of material more accessible and more usable because one can now do digital searches amongst statutes and case law of a kind that our academic predecessors were not able to do. It is also noteworthy and again important when understanding the development of administrative law in the UK that the principal superior courts in the UK remained constant over 700 years. We had a whole series of more local courts, but the central superior courts were the Court of King's Bench, the Court of Common Pleas, and the Court of Exchequer. They came into existence in the beginning of the 12th century. They had various infighting between them, but basically those courts adjudicated on and developed judicial review constantly over 700 years. Now, as Sabino has already indicated, there was in the UK statutory regulation of diverse matters. Basically, in the UK, if it moved, the legislature regulated it, and if it didn't move, the legislature regulated it. They regulated just about everything. They regulated trade, such as leather, alcohol, iron, cloth. They regulated bankruptcy, poverty, unemployment, and vagrancy. They regulated land use, flood defenses, roads, railway, shipping, infrastructure of towns, health, factories, economic regulation broadly conceived, including product regulation, price and wage regulation, and customs duties. They also regulated liquor licensing, gambling, and morality. There was no sphere of life which was not regulated. Again, I want to emphasize that this regulation was not soft law. It was not in any way merely soft law. This regulation was through formal statute. I also want to give an idea, because I think it's important, not only about the range of areas over which regulatory legislation existed, but also the numbers. Okay, now, actually, we don't know the number, but I've done a calculation based on existing historical evidence, and I can, if anyone wants further and better details about how I came to the number, I can explain it over coffee or in questions or anything. But on my calculation, on a conservative estimate, between 1550 and the end of 1900, there were about 12,000 regulatory formal statutes. And again, sake of clarity, that is the formal statute. That does not include ordinance or rulemaking or bylaws. If you add those in, you can multiply that number very significantly. Okay, so just to put that in perspective, equally in terms of case law, some ideas of numbers is helpful. Again, from statistics that I have worked out from my own studies, just by way of example, there were in the period of study 1500, 1550 to the end of the century, there were 2,041 reported cases only concerning the poor law, and there were 2,712 cases involving flood defenses and the terrain of the commissioners of sewers. Now, again, just to emphasize, no one actually knows, real professional legal historians do not know the ratio of reported to unreported cases. I have asked the real experts what the ratio is, and actually I get different answers. But for example, one prominent legal historian thought that the ratio of reported to unreported cases was 1 to 4. So for every reported case, there were 4 unreported cases. Other people take different views. Suffice it to say that the total number of cases was much bigger than the numbers I've just given, because there were a lot of unreported cases. So what about administration? Central administrative responsibility was exercised through the King's advisors, the Privy Council, and by the early 18th century, some government departments. However, the front line for the discharge of regulatory legislation was occupied in part by justices of the peace, who had judicial, administrative, and regulatory responsibilities, and in more important part by commissioners, the latter who were in effect modern administrative agencies in embryo, with adjudicatory, decisional, and rulemaking powers. The concept of commission captured the idea of an authority and duty granted by the Crown, the terms of which could vary significantly. Commissioners were not part of the judiciary, nor were they organized according to some homogeneous institutional format. They were, however, integral to policy delivery in a whole series of different areas. There were, for example, commissioners of sewers, excise enclosures, tithes, loans for public works, municipal improvement, bankruptcy, and railways, to name but the principal examples. And that is without mention of bodies such as turnpike trustees, which undertook analogous functions in relation to roads, and the guardians of the poor, who oversaw the poor law, and factory inspectors, who took on a similar role in relation to factory safety. Commissioners bestrode the land. They were the chosen medium for administration across diverse areas. They made decisions and regulations that impacted directly on the citizen, and they were therefore, not surprisingly, the subject of judicial review, direct and collateral. Many of these bodies were later incorporated into either central or local government in the 19th century, in large part because Parliament desired a greater degree of control than was possible when the activity was undertaken by a board or commission. Now, there have, of course, been changes in the UK administrative landscape over time, many changes, and they're charted in detail in my book. But it's important to stress on this occasion the elements of continuity that characterize discharge of administrative power, because they have not changed markedly in the last 400 to 500 years. The administration in 1550 and 1650 had three principal mechanisms through which to effectuate and discharge the powers accorded to it by regulatory legislation. They could make decisions, they could make rules, or they could make contracts. Thus was it ever so, and the same was true in the 17th century and the 20th century. The regulatory legislation dealt with these issues in detail, with sophistication, and explicitly, and often dealt with it through amending statutes over time. So when it was clear that there were problems in the efficacy, the effectiveness of administration, they would amend the statute to plug the gap. So the regulatory legislation that gave power to, for example, commissioners would commonly cast the power to make individual decisions very broadly, including in this respect wide powers to investigate, collect evidence, and catch those who sought to escape the system. The regulatory legislation also routinely, I want to emphasize that, gave commissioners and other administrative authorities broad rulemaking powers expressly. This was not unusual, it was not exceptional, it was the norm. Ideas that rulemaking powers or anything akin to delegated legislation only became normal in the UK in the 19th century are wholly mistaken. Now, rulemaking power was given by statutes at this time for the very same reasons that it's given in the modern day. Okay? Rulemaking can help to ensure the efficacious discharge of the overall legislative mandate. Are we okay? It's okay. It's okay. So it is, for example, often implausible or inefficient to proceed solely through orders crafted for a particular case. If, for example, if improvement commissioners were the chosen modality to run towns and cities. Towns and cities up until the late 19th century were not run by local authorities. So Birmingham, London, Oxford was run by a group of bodies of people called improvement commissioners. They were administrative authorities with very broad powers, including powers to make rules. So if improvement commissioners wished to keep good order and cleanliness in their municipality, then they had to have rulemaking power designed to tell citizens about, for example, waste disposal, slaughterhouses, public baths, and prohibited nuisances. Similarly, if commissioners of sewers sought to act in a preventative capacity to prevent flooding in the countryside, then rules designed to regulate river usage and its maintenance were the sensible way to attain that objective. The regulatory legislation dating from 1550 onwards also routinely gave administrative power to make contracts. Thus, to take one of many prominent examples, prior to the end of the 19th century, as I've just said, the principal authorities for the running of towns were improvement commissioners, with a different set of commissioners for each locality. They were responsible for just about everything in your towns and cities. They were incredibly important people and administrative institutions. They often had to fulfill those duties through making contracts. The improvement commissioners themselves were not capable of paving the highway in the town, or developing the sewers, or constructing the public slaughterhouses. They worked through making contracts. They were given detailed power to make such contracts, and those contracts, the payment of it was then charged on the local populace through a tax on householders. Okay. Equally important and marvelous. I mean, I remember this when I was researching the book, and I just thought, I really did think it was a kind of wow moment. I mean, just in terms of doing the research. Many of the things that we think about as being novel about contracting and administrative authorities in the 20th century, such as contracting out or public-private partnerships. We were doing it in the UK in spades from the middle of the 16th century onwards. We had a term for contracting out. It was called farming. So revenue revenue collection, there weren't any centralized people to collect your revenue. Revenue was partly collected by farming out the task to contractors who got paid to collect the taxes. Equally, public-private partnerships were the norm. Just about all infrastructure development in the UK, whether it was roads or rail or shipping or canals, was operated through a form of public-private partnership. Let me now, given the limits of time, move on to the second part, which is the part about courts and doctrine and judicial review. It was against the backdrop that I have just articulated that the courts created and developed the principles of judicial review from the middle of the 16th century onwards. It is indeed fascinating, having listened to Sabino's talk and been reminded of Dice's view, of just how wrong-headed he was. So Dice's view, denigratory view about droit administratif, was formulated on the assumption that this would give privileges to the administration and would be, in that sense, harmful to the individual. Nothing could be further from the truth. He got it completely the wrong way around. In the UK, when administrative law was developed, it was developed in order to protect, and did protect, the citizens against the administration when the administration exceeded its power. So courts from the from 1550 onwards, fashioned the grounds of judicial review, and they refined them thereafter. The principles of natural justice dated back to Magna Carta, but were given concrete expression in the early 17th century and applied broadly thereafter by the courts. There was well-established case law on review of law and fact from the 17th century onwards. There was doctrine dating back to the 16th century on legal control of discretion, which was cast in terms of propriety of purpose, fettering, delegation, reasonableness review, and review for proportionability. There was jurisprudence on legal control of prerogative power and common law regulatory power. There was jurisprudence on invalidity and damages liability. The substantive and procedural doctrine was given force through judicial creativity in relation to remedies, manifest partly but not wholly in the transformation of the prerogative writs and the use of collateral challenge. This judicial reasoning process was normative, incremental, and analogical. Whenever I talk in such a setting, I'm always mindful of getting across or trying to get across common law reasoning techniques and understanding of how common law works and functions to people who have been schooled in a civil law tradition. Both traditions are marvelous. They're just slightly different traditions in terms of how courts function. Administrative law is a wonderful, wonderful template, example of common law reasoning in action in a particular area. It is fabulous for watching the unfolding of legal doctrine. There is, in a common law world, a beginning to all legal doctrine, and legal history enables us to see it unfolding from its inception. Courts would create legal doctrine and did create legal doctrine based on normative precepts as to what the applicable legal rules ought to be on a particular issue. That was so for issues as diverse as error of law or fact, natural justice, misfeasance in public office, and constraints on discretion. They reasoned through in first principle what the doctrine should be and created the doctrine and then applied the doctrine in analogical fashion in subsequent cases. Now, it was not uncommon for there to be contestation as to underlying values or their application. Things were no different in that respect in the 17th century and in the 20th century. Not all the judges agreed about all the things, obviously, and that was true in the 17th century and in the 20th century. But what we did tend to get was a pattern emerging. You got, in any one of these areas, a leading case laying the groundwork, which was then shaped and transformed and adapted and refined in subsequent cases. Important to note that while there's commonality between then and now, there's one important difference, which is the numbers of judges. The judges in the 17th century had more power. Why? Because of the very limit of their numbers. Each of these three superior courts at any one time had 4 to 5 judges. So the 4 to 5 judges, while they held tenure, ruled the roost. They were the kings, as it were, in shaping administrative law doctrine and contract doctrine and delict in their area. Even more so because there wasn't any formal system of appeal. There was something called the writ of error, which I don't have time to go into, but there was not the standard appeal of the kind that we're used to in the modern day. Now, what was driving the courts then in developing this doctrine? The general background objective and value was the need to render public power legally accountable, which connoted the twin ideas that an institution should comply with the conditions laid down in the enabling grant of power, and that it should comply with certain precepts of good governance, thereby enhancing legitimacy. That was the imperative for judicial involvement and the most basic rationale for judicial review. The development was doctrinally incremental and driven through procedural and substantive doctrine coupled with remedial expansion. Okay. Now, as I said, the doctrinal categories were not value-free. There was contestation. But the existence of those categories and their more specific meaning was the result of reasoned analysis that drew on and gave more concrete expression to the twin foundational, excuse the Freudian slip, the twin foundational ideas that underpin judicial review set out above. The need to ensure that the administrative agency stayed within the scope of power given to it by Parliament on the one hand, and the need to ensure that it fulfilled and met certain precepts of good administration on the other. Very briefly, let me give you a couple of examples of this. Consider firstly certain core doctrines of JR, judicial review. It is axiomatic that if the courts are to render public power accountable, then there has to be legal doctrine that serves to keep the relevant public body within its assigned sphere of power. Now, I am not pushing forward any simple transmission belt theory of administrative law. The limitations of that theory were powerfully expressed, amongst others, by Richard Stewart, in his famous article in the Harvard Law Review. But nonetheless, there is a core sense in which this was the real driver of JR. It was designed to ensure that the administration remained within the boundaries of the power set by Parliament. So if, for example, Parliament gave power and duties to the administration to look after people in a particular village who were impoverished, then that necessitated a legal definition of what impoverished meant, because the obligations on the village to look after those people only applied if the people were impoverished. Equally, if an excise statute set a certain excise duty, a tax, on strong wines perfectly made, which was a term of art in the legislation, then if you had low quality wines, not strong wines perfectly made, then they should be subject to a different excise duty. Challenges of this kind came before the courts routinely, and they dealt with them and developed the principles of judicial review. They equally developed the principles of judicial review concerning the consequences of invalidity. Every legal system, without any exception, has to develop doctrine as to what are the legal consequences if an administrative decision is found to be null and void. Is it truly retrospectively invalid, ab initio, or are there going to be qualifications to that voidness ab initio? The courts in the 17th century were faced with those issues. They dealt with those issues, and they dealt with them in detail and with intriguing case law. A second example, very briefly. Consider also in this respect the fact that courts developed from the outset principles of legality that took account of moral precepts that were designed to enhance good governance. A prime instance of this is, of course, natural justice. It was central to the objective of rendering public power accountable. Natural justice was reflective of the twin precepts of judicial review identified above. But there's another less well-known but equally important principle which was developed by the courts from common law doctrine in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, which was that a public body which wielded power de jure or de facto over a certain asset could charge no more than a reasonable price for the use of that asset. The courts developed from first principles ideas of public property rights, in effect, and that if the administration was granted a public property right, which gave it a de facto or de jure monopoly, then it could charge no more than a reasonable price. Final example, very briefly, controls over discretion. Again, fascinating when you read English case law. Oh, it's fascinating to me when I was writing the book, fascinating studying this English case law, we tend to think we're a lot smarter than our forebears. There's no doubt that in certain respects we are, but we shouldn't press this too far. Equally, we should not press too far the idea that we had some fundamental insights about the relationship between court and administration that was lost on our judicial forebears. Our judicial forebears understood, on the one hand, the need for legal control over discretion. They also understood absolutely clearly that they should not, as a matter of principle or practicality, be substituting judgment for that of the administration as to how the discretion was exercised. They developed fine-tuned principles of both reasonableness review and review for proportionability, which was a forerunner to proportionality review in a whole series of statutes and cases. And just, I should say in brackets, bringing back to statute, proportionability was an express ground of review specified in approximately 1,960 statutes dealing with diverse areas. Okay. Finally, because my time is running out, or it probably has run out, just 2 minutes about the remedial dimension of what the courts were doing. In UK administrative law, we actually do have a wealth of different administrative law remedies, and that wealth of remedies help to fashion the administrative law doctrine in this period and that we have today. The one point I want to emphasize now, because of limits of time, is this. As you all know, in common law systems, we don't have the kind of divide between public law and private law that exists in civil law systems, in the sense that we don't have a separate regime of separate courts and the like. However, it's much less well known that the absence of that divide facilitated the development of administrative law doctrine. Let me explain. In the foundational period of administrative law, 1550 onwards, you could use a delict action against a commissioner of sewers or commissioner of excise, okay? There was nothing to stop you suing them for damages. Now, what happened was the following, and this is why these cases were so creative in developing administrative law doctrine. Someone would bring a delict action. Let me give you a real example rather than the hypothetical one. It's a marvelous example, and it's a real case. 1598, Brooks case.
Come facciamo a farlo ascoltare?
Attiva audio, forse è il mio, avevo attivato il mio audio probabilmente.
In any event, Rook's case from, was it something I said? Maybe. Rook's case from 1598. Okay, what happens in this case? It's a wonderful example in miniature of the way in which administrative law developed in the UK. 1598, commissioners of sewers who are like a modern environmental agency. They were responsible for flood prevention, land use, etc. They do some repairs on a river, okay? They then charge one landowner for the entire cost of the repair. The one landowner is a bit upset, okay? He's saying, why just me? Why are you charging just me?
Il professor Polcri che sta parlando in inglese.
because in the
La
circumstances, a lot of other people have
Non lo
benefited.
sento, non sento nessun audio.
Però io lo sento dal telefono, sento...
Sento il telefono, sì, ci stiamo parlando, quindi
Oh, well, we've got somebody else online.
No, di nuovo.
Webcam, professore.
Disconnettetevi perché se no noi sentiamo quello che voi dite. Ecco, Mimmo.
Okay, I'm sorry, just literally 1 minute, then I'll, no, 1 minute, I'll finish. So the landowner who's been charged the entire burden has the temerity to complain. And then the commissioners of sewers, showing their power, do two things. Firstly, they put him in prison. And secondly, they steal or they take all his cattle. They say, you're not paying the fine, we're taking all your cattle in payment of the fine. He brings a legal action. Now, the legal action he brings is not for a pure public law remedy. He brings an action which is called at that time an action in replaving. Okay, it was an action basically which you could use against the private citizen saying, you have my goods, give my goods back to me. Okay, the commissioners of sewers say, we have discretion as to who to charge. We charge this person, you, the courts, can't interfere with our discretion. Chief Justice Cook, in a famous judgment in 1598, said, you're quite wrong. You're quite wrong. The discretion is bounded by equity and justice. There are controls in terms of the reasonableness of the exercise of discretion. It is wholly unreasonable to charge one person when a number of people have drawn the benefit. So that administrative law doctrine was developed through a case which got to the courts through a private law cause of action. Once reasonableness review was developed by the courts, it was then applied across all causes of action and across all remedies. I've overstayed my welcome. Thank you very much indeed.
We move now from England to France. Jacques Ziller.
Thank you. First, I would like to thank Aldo Sandoli and the board of AIPDA for having me invited to present the French case. In Italy, I'm known as a professor of European Union law, but I was born as a professor of administrative law and of comparative administrative law, which explains my presence here. Now, should we speak of perception and reality as the title of this session, or rather, for the French case, a change in narratives? You'll see there is an abundant literature on the so-called paradox of the observer, according to which the researcher influences what he observes, even in quantum physics, let alone in social science. Now, the same phenomenon obviously applies to research with the birth and growth of administrative law, as clearly shown for France. It goes without saying that it also applies to what I will say today in 5 points, not 2. I'm French. We know the French are not obsessed by 2 parts. And it's clearly due to the fact that I started studying administrative law 55 years ago, when I was in the 2nd year of the licence en droit. And I'm busy with comparative administrative law since I started researching for my PhD in law a few years later. So, first point, the birth of French administrative law. Turn of 18th to 19th century or 14th century. The usual narrative went like this until recently. normally I would have started by saying this started all with the setting up of the Conseil d'État by the Constitution of 13 December 1799 by Napoleon Bonaparte, and the law of 17 February 1800, which established the administrative organization of France's territory with 4 levels: département, arrondissement, canton, commune, a list of communes which remained the same until 1926, and it's only in the 1970s that we established also regions. Now, the same law established also the prefect, the préfet, as representative of the state at the level of the département, and the Conseil de Préfecture in charge of adjudication in relation to direct taxation, public procurement, claims by individuals against public works contractors in connection with such works, the authorization for municipalities to bring legal procedures and disputes relating to national property, and all this with an appeal to the Conseil d'État, which was preparing the education by the consul or emperor. By the way, Napoleon himself said that he always followed what the Conseil d'État proposed. So the illusion that it was the emperor who ruled on this is wrong. The second point would have been the transition from so-called retained justice to delegated justice with the law of 24 May 1872, by which the Conseil d'État was deciding in the name of the people, not anymore giving an advice. And also, I would start with a third point, which is the recognition of the autonomy of administrative law in relation to civil and commercial law by the famous Blanco judgment of the Tribunal des Conflits of 8 February 1873. Tribunal des Conflits, which had been created already in the Second Republic, by the way, in the 1840s, late 1840s, a joint body composed of equal number of members of the Conseil d'État and the Cour de Cassation, and which was in charge of determining which court was competent for dealing with an issue. So this was the classical way of presenting it until a few years, a decade. In short, administrative law was the product of the French Revolution, submitting public administration to the rule of law. There are alternative narratives. Now, Sabino Cassese has already hinted to Alexis de Tocqueville, L'Ancien Régime et la Révolution, who demonstrated that there was much more continuity in French institutions than the terminology and history of the revolution of 1789 would suggest. But let's not forget that Alexis de Tocqueville suffered also of the paradox. Alexis de Tocqueville, before going to the United States, was a judge, a civil judge. So in France at that time, a civil judge could only hate administrative law, hate the Conseil d'État, hate the Conseil de Préfecture. And so it was quite not natural that for him, it was the worst thing that could happen. He would have liked civil judges to deal with this. Closing the parenthesis. Now, the alternative narrative is quite well known nowadays. Even artificial intelligence knows it. I tried with the AI system of Google, Gemini, and it started with the 14th century before I even published something. So it means that they have fed a few of the things which I will talk about. Now, it suffices to cite a few names. Pierre Legendre, June 1930, March 2023. Pierre Legendre was a remarkable man, both legal historian and psychoanalyst. You don't have this very often. And Pierre Legendre was one of the first who tried to reverse the traditional view about administrative law. Then you had Jean-Louis Mestre, who published in 1985 a handbook on the introduction to history of French administrative law. Jean-Louis Mestre, whom if you read German, you can also read a chapter in the Jus Publicum Europaeum, which is an enormous treaty of comparative law, which some of you know. More recently, we have two handbooks, one by Marie-Hélène Renaud, who's a professor of legal history, who has published a concise handbook of Histoire du droit administratif in 2007, and another by Katia Weidenfeld, Histoire du droit administratif du XIVe siècle à nos jours, which was published in 2010. And it's interesting, both a professor of legal history and a judge at the Tribunal Administratif de Paris since 2023. So it is slowly coming to the mind that it did not all start with the French Revolution. Now, to cut a long story short of this second narrative, it is true that the expression administrative law, droit administratif, has not been used, as far as we know, before the beginning of the 19th century. But there were a series of public bodies and offices, like in England, but since earlier, since the 14th century, since the time of the Magna Carta. But France was a more populated country, obviously. Now, there were also a number of local governments, cities, provinces, which were independent from the king, and there was the king administration, and both those local authorities and king's administration exercised typical rule-making and education powers. As far as education is concerned, a progressive judicialization has taken place in the way they acted, and also in their independence from the bodies they were judging upon. And from 1789, from the revolution to the mid-19th century, there were back and forth movements which eventually crystallized in what I would call adult administrative law, the administrative law of the 19th century. Furthermore, and contrary to the usual narrative, the pre-revolutionary administrative law was not merely protecting public bodies and offices, it was also protecting individuals as was further developed by adult administrative law. A last precision, the word administration has been used by courts, les cours souveraines, civil courts, if you want to call them like this, instead of police, since 1756 onwards. But it was the same thing. It was first called police and then administration. And the terms droit administratif, as far as we know, have been first used, at least published, by Jean-Charles Bonin in 1808 in an article called on the importance and necessity of a code, of an administrative code. That's about the first point, change in narratives. Now, what about the growth of judge-made administrative law? Because it is well known that French administrative law is conceptualized as a mainly judge-made administrative law, which is only true to a certain extent. Now, already before 1799, there were administrative bodies reviewing decisions of lower bodies. And this has led to the establishment of the Conseil d'État and the Conseil de Préfecture, of which I have already talked. Mind you, nowadays, there are the tribunaux administratifs, cours administratifs d'appel, so 3 levels of administrative courts and Conseil d'État, but there are still quite a number of semi-judicial bodies. For instance, the disciplinary commissions of public universities. I once was a judge when I was a member of the disciplinary commission of my university in Paris 2. A few complementary remarks. Differently from England, I'm afraid we don't have yet a digitalization of all judgments reported. And also reports of courts are something which is more recent than in England. Hence, legal historians in France are mainly using classical history research, like going to archives and so on and so forth. The reports of the Conseil d'État's ruling were published first since 1806 by Jean-Baptiste Siret, and they're still today the famous journal Siret, and still publishing reports. And then from 1821 onwards, Macquerel, Sabino Cassé already quoted him, started publishing what later became the Recueil Le Bon, which are the classical French reports of the jurisprudence of the Conseil d'État. Now, the competence of sovereign courts of the Ancien Régime became more and more limited in administrative matters from 1407 onwards. So it's wrong to assume what certainly Tocqueville assumed, that the poor civil judges have been deprived by the revolution of their powers. Because most of them, their powers were devolved to the intendants, who were delegates of the king, predecessors of the modern prefects, and to the Conseil du Roi, which was then developed in specialist bodies, predecessors of the modern Conseil d'État and Court of Auditors. Now, during the Ancien Régime, there was an adjudicatory system, which was already much quicker and cheaper than remedies going to court. It was more easy, more quick to go to court for single persons. Appeals were open to single persons, and those adjudicatory bodies balanced the interests of the single persons and those of administration. So what is true is that it's mainly in the 19th century, with the case law of the Conseil d'État, but also a number of decisions of the Conseil de Préfecture, that the interests of the singles were more and more taken into account. And what we had in the Ancien Régime slowly developed in a quasi-judicial review, as I said, and this was continued after the revolution. As I already said, even Napoleon did follow what the Conseil d'État was proposing. The possibility of courts to adjudicate on administrative matters was definitely banned by laws of the revolution, the famous law of 1724, August 1790, which Tocqueville could not but hate, being himself a judge which could not adjudicate on matters of administration. Now, also during the Ancien Régime, the modern grounds of annulment were established since the 14th century. Lack of competence, procedural irregularity, illegality, failure to pursue common good or a general interest, which was later called misuse of powers, and you recognize not only the grounds of appeal with the Conseil d'État and administrative courts today, but also the grounds of annulment by the Court of Justice, Article 263 TFEU. There was, that is true, an absence of codification of administrative law, contrary to civil, criminal, and commercial law, which were all codified in the beginning of the 19th century. With the exception of commercial law, there was already a commercial code in 1673. Now, the development of administrative law was not only due to case law. That's also important to underline. For instance, the famous decree of 2nd November 1864 on the procedure before the Conseil d'État has been a text which has led to a general theory of judicial remedies. More than one century later, we have the Code des tribunaux administratifs in 1973, and the Code de justice administrative in 2000, and the French Administrative Procedure Act, Code des relations entre le public et l'administration, in 2015. But in all those cases, what is remarkable is that the codification, small or big, was inspired or driven by the Conseil d'État himself. I'll come to it later. Now, administrative law was, this being said, mainly developed as judge-made law by the Conseil d'État, with the exception of the law of administrative organization, entirely legislative and regulatory, as far as state, local, and regional authorities are concerned, and also for autonomous bodies, établissements publics, which had also their forefathers in the Ancien regime, where they were called commissioners, like in England. I mean, the channel was easy to cross. And even for a long time, the civil service law was mainly judge-made until the infamous codification by the law of Pétain in 1941, which excluded Jews and married women from the civil service, and the modern democratic Statut Général de la Fonction Publique of 1946. Now, what are the main features of judge-made law as it developed? First, the autonomy of administrative law as to civil law. That is mainly what the Blanco judgment did, saying the civil code does not apply to, in that case, public services. The use of general principles of law. The Conseil d'État itself only started using the wording principes généraux du droit applicable, même en l'absence de texte, general principles which apply even in the absence of a written provision, only since a judgment Aramu of October 1945. However, it applies those concepts since, in its cases, since 1872. Even La Ferrière, of whom I will speak later, mentioned this. My explanation, but it's a personal one, is that it was first due to the fact that the Declaration of Human Rights of 1789 was not positive law during the Third Republic. It was a soft law instrument, if I may say so. So the Conseil d'État had to develop its own principles in order to adjudicate. And there was, as I said, a growing protection of individuals against discretion, partly during the Ancien Regime, like in England, and also with, as well, judge-made law and legislation inspired by the Conseil d'État. For instance, a law of 17 July 19 generalized the rule which the Conseil d'État had already established, according to which silence of public authorities for more than 4 months, today it's 2 months, meant refusal of the requested action. Now, this also led to the importance of studying case law in courses of administrative law at universities. When I was a student, we used a case book which was already published the first time in 1956 by Marsolon, Prosper Veil, and Guy Bréban, Les Grands Arrêts de la Jurisprudence Administrative, which has gone to its 24th edition in 2023. Remarkable, Marsolon and Guy Bréban were 2 members of the Conseil d'État. Prosper Veil was an academic. Now, let us come to a third point, which is the contribution to scholarship to the growth of administrative law. Now, there are two specific features. First, administrative law scholarship in France was mainly developed by handbooks and textbooks by members of the Conseil d'État. Also, this probably was not something which Tocqueville liked very much. Gérando, Macarel, Cormenin, I will not go into details, which were considered as the forerunners by Oriou of administrative scholarship. Also, I want to mention Alexandre François Vivien, whose Études administratives in 1845 are extremely interesting because it's not only administrative law, it's administrative science in the modern sense, and which shows very well how in France the figures of delegation of public service and also public-private partnerships, we didn't call it that way, were already present. Not to mention Léon Coq was also a member of the Conseil d'État, and interestingly, he was teaching at the École des Ponts et Chaussées because French administration in the 19th century and until recently was mainly an administration of engineers. And so those who became engineers of roads and bridges had to be also educated in administrative law. France was a much broader territory than England, and therefore there was already a school of engineers of roads and bridges since 1742. Now, I will not go in more details, but mention two names, very well known of academics, two very famous names, Maurice Oriou and Léon Duguy. Oriou, who gave birth to the School of Toulouse, where he was a professor and dean, and Duguy, Bordeaux, where he was, they were both became full professors at the examination, the Concours d'Agrégation of 1882. And both were authors of very important handbooks on administrative and constitutional law, which were systematizing the disciplines. They were authors of numerous comments to judgments. And Duguy, for instance, also was an applicant in a very famous case, Roisseghet-Tivoli, because he wanted the Conseil d'État to solve an issue which, as a scholar, he found needed to be solved. Now, Oriou, some of you probably already know it, started what is known as the School of Public Power, la puissance publique, and Duguy, the School of Service Public. The difference with both is that, according to Oriou, administrative law was mainly the law of the application of public power, whereas for Duguy, it was mainly the application of public service. Mind you, public service in French is different as a concept. It is something different than the addition of public services in many other countries. Now, this debate between the two schools has lasted for a very, very long time. It has, to a certain extent, frozen scholarship. When I became a student, there were still discussions about is it or not service public or puissance publique. And it's only in 1968 that the question was, in a certain sense, solved by René Chaput, il mio maestro, I would say in Italian, who published an article in 1968 where he explained that administrative law was the law of service public, and administrative education, contentieux administratif, the law of the education about public power, and then it has been refined. There have been debates about this, but I would say that after Oriou and Duguy and a few of their successors, the broad view of systematizing in the way they did it stopped. However, I want to say just one word about René Chaput. I had him as a professor of constitutional law in the first year. I had Vedel in the second year for administrative law, and Chaput again in the third and fourth year for the law of civil service, the law of public property, and the law of the contentieux administratif of administrative judicial procedure. Now, fourth point, the scope, tools, and principles of administrative law in adulthood all started to develop in the Ancien Régime and were further developed during the 19th century, sometime the 20s. The scope of administrative law in France is both the law of public authority making decisions and the organization of public authority, and also the law of public service, which is far more, it's a concept as such, it's not simply the sum of public authorities. The law of expropriation for public use has been developed during the Ancien Régime already in order to protect the individuals. The law of rule-making and single decision-making are both administrative law in France, and it's very important to have in mind that the Conseil d'État can adjudicate on decrees. And even since 1995, the administrative courts can issue injunction, and the Conseil d'État can issue injunctions to the government to adopt a certain decree. Now, public contracts are also part of administrative law, like what we heard for England. for the reasons I mentioned. And the law of public service, property and civil service is part of administrative law. So it's a very broad scope. The tools, I will not go in details, only mention two. One, in France, what we call an acte administratif, are both general acts, regulations, and individual decisions. And they are all submitted to judicial review because gradually the Conseil d'État has abandoned its theory of acte du gouvernement, which is sometimes, and certainly during the 19th century, presented as one of the features which were not democratic. Also, as I already mentioned, the concession de service public and concession de travaux publics were very much used, and we had a lot of public-private partnerships. Then a number of principles, subordination of administrative authorities to the rule of law, broad concept of standing. Since 1901, there's an extremely broad concept of standing, which is much broader, I would say, than in Italy or in Germany, for instance. The use of general principles of law, and also a specific feature, namely the use of equality as a principle that's really typical revolutionary principle, although it to some extent applied first, in different fields. It was applied to examination for access to public service, but also, and that's the most interesting one, liability for breach of equality before public burdens, responsabilité pour rupture de l'égalité devant les charges publiques. And this is illustrated by a judgment of 1938, Société La Fleurette, which is both very interesting because it imposes liability for acts of parliaments long before Frankovic and Bonifaci, but also it is liability without fault. It's not torts, is objective liability. So generally speaking, more and more important balancing of protection of individual rights and freedom in their sense, and I will not go into details. Last point, the two more recent developments are the constitutionalization of administrative law and its Europeanization. On the constitutionalization, a few words. There has been a debate in the 50s, and with the Constitution of 1958, there's a very important dialogue between the Conseil constitutionnel, our constitutional court, and the Conseil d'État about who is dealing with regulations and ordinance. Here, I will not go into detail because we don't have time. Also, the second point is Europeanization. It's well known that until 1969, the Conseil d'État was resisting to the primacy of EC law and then slowly adopted it. But what is less known is that there is an important impact of the European Convention of Human Rights since 74 when France ratified it and 81 when it accepted the individual appeals. This has led to a reform of the procedure of the Court of Auditors. Then the law of 1995 giving the power of injunction to administrative judges. It's because the Conseil d'État thought that it was better not to wait for a condemnation by the European Courts of Human Rights, and to the reform of the Commissaire du Gouvernement, now Rapporteur Public, which was in a dialogue with Strasbourg, a complex story, which has changed a little bit the position of the Rapporteur Public and brought to the possibility to parties to reply to its conclusion. Now, where are we? John Kerr, who was Secretary General of the European Convention in 2003 said when he was starting a meeting of his staff, we are where we are. Well, contrary to grim conclusions of the two more recent handbooks I mentioned, I do not see a profound crisis of French administrative law and administrative justice, and also not a real decline of what is called in French the exorbitant nature of administrative law. Exorbitant is not pejorative. And I don't think, contrary to a number of colleagues, that the future is for shrinking administrative law and adjudication by administrative courts to bring it back to civil courts. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much, Jack. Now we move to Germany. Professor Eberhard Schmidt-Amsman is not with us, but we have his report.
So, thank you very much. Professor Schmidt-Amsman unfortunately cannot be with us, and he asked me to say that he's very unhappy about that, but there are serious medical reasons for that, so he couldn't join. And I will just read his speech, so you will get to assess my reading skills. Okay, the 19th century was a key period for the development of German administrative law. The century opened with the ideas of freedom contained in Kant's writing, the French Revolution, and the American Constitution of 1787, and in practice, the Stein-Hardenberg reforms of 1806. From the middle of the century, separate administrative courts were created for legal protection and quickly developed into a dominant force, above all the Preußische Oberverwaltungsgericht. At the end of the century, administrative law was firmly established and represented by numerous textbooks, most prominently Otto Meyer's Deutsches Verwaltungsrecht of 1896, with its clear distinction and legal forms, which still form part of the core of administrative law in academia and the courts today. The three main actors in this development are thus identified: legislation, courts, and scholarship. As Michael Stolleis argues in his History of Public Law in Germany, the end of the 19th century is the birth of administrative law and administrative law scholarship. We have thus arrived at the Belle Époque of administrative law in Europe, of which Olivier Jean-Jean speaks, and for which names such as Orlando, Laferrière, Oriou, and also Meyer are leading exponents. In Germany, Meyer and his students created what I call classical administrative law, a great achievement based on a great design idea that still has an impact today. Great ideas are also great because of their simplifications. They develop models with sharp edges and narratives with catchy attribution in this context. Meyer himself speaks of the spirit of deliberate one-sidedness. Reality is not carefully depicted, but consciously selected. Such reductionism is not inadmissible per se, but it is necessary to critically examine the traditional models and narrative time and again, and minimize the tensions between perception and reality through reflection. This already becomes clear when one asks about administrative law in previous times. Of course, administrative law already existed before the 19th century, and it certainly had its own profile. In classical administrative law, however, this is often only treated as a preliminary stage with some disdain, or even worse, used as a negative contrast to his own higher level of development. There were reasons for this. The classicists, proud of the Bismarck Empire, founded in 1871, and the newly conquered nation station, considered older constitutional conditions in Germany to be backward, opaque, and powerless. But such an assessment cannot be accepted, because thinking of preliminary stages only recognize what appears important given later developments, and thus distorts the real content. I would therefore like to start by looking at these so-called preliminary stages. They begin with what historians call the early modern era, the period from 1015 onwards. For Germany, this is the period of the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, which was founded by Charlemagne and dissolved in the wake of Napoleonic Wars, hereinafter referred to as the Old Empire, an entity that cannot be grasped with our categories of constitutional law, above all with the concept of the nation state, a loose association of large and small territories, an elective monarchy with an emperor who could only act in cooperation with the secular and ecclesiastical territorial princes, the Landesherren. This dualism characterized the entire constitutional structure. Unlike France, Germany did not develop a centralized administration in the early modern era. Administration was essentially a matter for territories, cities, and also the church. From a systematic point of view, the origins of administrative law, therefore, also include municipal law and canon law. And behind all of these is Roman law, which, in the words of Sabino Cassese, provided the legal grammar for the construction of the intellectual building of administrative law. Unlike today, all these sources were by no means organized hierarchically, but existed side by side and intertwined. There was a pluralism of legal sources. People lived in several legal circles and under several jurisdictions. This seems non-transparent and threatening to us today. However, it also had a protective function, as it did not expose the individual to the whole of a centralized sovereign power. This becomes evident in two typical problems of administrative law: the question of legitimate administrative text, policy or policy, and the question of legal protection against administrative measures, Untertanenprozesse, subjects trial. In the early modern era, polis meant the good order of the Commonwealth, bonus commune. The imperial police code, passed at the Imperial Diet of Worms in 1495, which was followed by many other laws of this kind in the territories and states, was based on this meaning dated back to Aristotle. These laws show what the government should be concerned with: peaceful coexistence of people, regulations against usury, excessive prices, the carrying of weapons in public, fire protection and other safety issues, hygiene, buildings regulation, the agricultural field, forest and etc. Many things were useful to ensure public safety and social harmony. Other activities were added. After the devastating 30 Years' War from 1650 onwards, it was also a matter of promoting agriculture, trade, mercantilism, and population development. In other words, what we now call service administration, Leistungsverwaltung. However, some regulation had a tendency towards paternalism from the outset, such as the detailed rules against luxury in clothing and parties. This tendency increased more and more. The governments in the territories, the Landesherren, used them to further expand their power. Policy was transformed from a term with positive connotations into a formula that attempted to orient, patronize people in all areas of life. Pressures generated counter-pressure. It was precisely in this tension that the structures of administrative law developed. This can be seen in the academic literature, especially in the contemporary manuals of police science, science of policing. In the early years, the various areas of police duties were only outlined and gave practical advice only on how to fulfill them well. With further systematization and refinement, legal problems also became apparent. The welfare of the state and the welfare of the people it governed no longer appeared to be identical per se. A dividing line between the interests of governments and the interests of society became apparent. Confidence in individual initiative grew and suggested a greater degree of freedom, at least in certain policy areas, trade and commerce. The content of the policy and the legal forms used to enforce it thus began to separate. This was a quote. Two ideas that were developed into legal institutions during this period illustrate this: the fiscal theory and the principle of proportionality. The fiscal theory fiscus theory is based on the idea of a separation between the state acting in a sovereign capacity and the state assets treasury. The fiscus theory made it possible to obtain compensation for encroachments on vested rights if the encroachment could not be fended off, compensation as a minimum standard. The principle of proportionality, Verhältnismäßigkeitsprinzip, is based on the idea that state intervention is only lawful if it is necessary for the common good, and the administration has to demonstrate this before intervention. Both ideas were not just theoretical constructs from the liberal spirit of the Enlightenment, but also found their ways into laws. This can be seen in the Prussian General Land Law of 1794, which limits the scope of the police to maintaining public order and averting future dangers. The second pillar of the development of administrative law in the early modern era is legal protection in administrative matters. The dualism between the empire and the territories mentioned above made it possible to appeal to the Supreme Court of the Empire, Reichskammergericht, which had existed since 1500 if legal protection in the territories was inadequate. Plaintiffs could be towns, village communities, but also individuals. In addition to private law disputes, public law disputes could also be brought before the chamber court. Court, organization, and types of proceedings were regulated no less precisely than in modern procedural laws, in specific procedural laws. Hundreds of such trials are documented. Of course, the sovereigns tried to restrict this possibility by referring to their sovereign rights, jus eminens. However, if their measures violated vested rights, iura quesita, they did not succeed. The judges of the Imperial Chamber Court tended to further extend the protection of the subjects. The trials were lengthy and by no means always successful, but they strengthened the awareness that even sovereign power has its limits. The alleged antagonism between the police state and the rule of law, Rechtsstaat, as it was later claimed in popular abbreviation, therefore never existed in this form in Germany. The view that the scientification of administrative law was only an achievement of the 19th century is also incorrect. More recent research shows that the case law of the Imperial Chamber Court contributed significantly to the standardization as well as the scientification of the law as a result of the establishment of its own literary genre, the cameral publicistic. Important elements that characterize administrative law today, therefore, already existed at the end of the 18th century. A law that pointed out the legitimate text, but also the legal limits of police activities, a combination of red light and green light theory. The 19th century is usually perceived as the liberal century. However, it is also the century in which the social tasks of the state grew as a result of industrialization. In any case, the development of administrative law should not be viewed unilaterally as a limitation of state power. This appears to be the case in some theoretical writings, for example, in Wilhelm von Humboldt's famous essay on the limits of state effectiveness. Here too, however, the reality, the triad consisting of legislation, jurisdiction, and scholarship is more differentiated. This will be illustrated firstly by two developments from the first half of the century, and then by two famous controversial issues from the second half. After the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire in 1806, development in individual German states took center stage. This began with the Stein-Handerberg reforms in Prussia, 1807-1815. Stein wanted to put an end to the paternalism of the subjects, not, however, by limiting their duties, but by changing the organization of administration, an organization that would allow citizens to participate. The Prussian City Code of 1808 which he drafted, was the first law to give legal form to local self-government. It influenced legislation in other German states and laid the foundation for vital self-government at the municipal level. In the following decades, the cities became the most important administrative bodies providing people with essential services, water, gas, sewage disposal, schools, hospitals, etc. This gave rise to an independent branch of administration, services of general interest, die Leistungsverwaltung oder Daseinvorsorge, which developed its own legal instrument, statutes, bylaws, contracts under private law. At the same time, it becomes clear that the history of administrative law includes not only the tasks, but also the organization of administration as an equally important field. Organization's matter is, in fact, something that is sometimes underestimated in the literature on administrative law. The second development to be mentioned here is the transformation of police law into administrative law. However, this did not initially take place in Prussia, but in southern German states. These states had adopted progressive constitutions after the Congress of Vienna, Bavaria, 1818, Baden, 1818, and Württemberg, 1819, which guaranteed the inhabitants both certain fundamental rights, freedom of property, freedom of trade, etc., and also some limited participation in legislative activity of the state. On this basis, starting from 1830, Robert von Moll, professor first in Tübingen, then in Heidelberg, wrote his Police Science according to the principle of the rule of law, Polizeiwissenschaft nach den Grundsätzen des Rechtsstaats. This book title, which established the word rule of law, Rechtsstaats, in Germany, was in fact a program. Von Moll advocated a liberal position and opposed excessive police activities. However, he also recognized that the state cannot be limited to the prevention of danger alone, but must also perform social tests. Therefore, von Moll did not want to limit the number of tests, but rather regulate how they were fulfilled. Restriction through juridification. They are the subject of administrative law, which is derived from constitutional law. Police law require the approval of the state's assembly. Government ordinances must have a basis in police law. State acts that affect the people require formal publication, and coercive measures may only be taken to remedy violation of the law. The principle of proportionality must always be observed. 100 years later, Ernst Forsthoff criticized von Moll for lagging behind the corresponding works of the later period where conceptual and systematic questions are concerned. This is certainly true. However, I would like to warn against overestimating the systematic side of the development of administrative law. The decisive factor is that theoretical concepts are gradually being put into practice. Von Moll thus outlined the core of the rule of law in administrative law. Now, to the aforementioned disputes that characterize the development of administrative law in the second half of the 19th century. The first concerned the form of legal protection against the administration. We have emphasized the important role of the imperial chamber court in the Old Reich. With the fall of the Old Empire, this protection ceased to exist. Legal protection could now only be obtained from the courts of federal states. The monarchic governments opted for administrative justice modeled on the French system and integrated into the administration. The liberal middle classes argued in favor of ordinary courts because they expected a greater degree of independence from them. The solution was a compromise, a two-state justice system which organizationally belonged to the executive, but whose judges at the second level, higher administrative court, had full judicial independence. Here too, southern Germany led the way. Baden in 1864, Prussia in 1876, with the establishment of its Supreme Administrative Court, which quickly became a recognized actor in the field of administrative law. The second major dispute concerns the method of administrative law. Earlier centuries had focused on the tasks of administration and initially treated legal issues as just one among other aspects, for example, the economic, historical, or political aspect. The so-called Staatswissenschaftliche Methode, political science method, is this one. Compared with contemporary private law theory, this conglomerate appeared syncretistic and unscientific from 1850 onwards. I'm sorry, it's the methodological ideal that prevailed from 1850 onwards demanded a strict separation of legal and political arguments, the so-called legal method, juristische Methode. The protagonists were Karl Friedrich Gerber and, somewhat later, Paul Labande. It is characterized by the exclusivity with which the legal concepts and constructs are sealed off from all political influences. Gerber is very clear at this point. On this basis, Friedrich Franz Mayer developed the first system of administrative law, Grundsätze des Verwaltungsrechts, 1862. After the foundation of the German Empire in 1871, numerous other influential authors followed this program. However, its perfect realization was achieved in Otto Mayer's Deutsches Verwaltungsrecht, 1896, we all know that. Mayer's concept is based on two opposing principles. On the one hand, the sovereignty of the state to which the individual is subject, Untertan, and on the other hand, the idea of the rule of law, which protects the individual by bringing the sovereign power of the state into the form and shape of law. The most important forms are the general law and the concrete decision with which the administration executes the law, the Administrative Act, which Mayer construes in parallel to the judicial judgment. The legislator gives the administration the rules according to which it has to decide, and the courts check whether these rules are adhered to. The administration and the courts use the same legal tools and, if they apply them correctly, arrive at the same result, the so-called theory of the one correct decision, a fiction rather than a reality, sure, but convincing for lawyers. Administration thus becomes determinable, predictable, and controllable. Mayer's administrative law is an administrative law of clear legal forms. It is characterized by precise concepts, clear distinction, and highly plausible conclusions. A large number of scholars continued Mayer's idea. Mayer's concept also characterized the administrative law of the Weimar Republic. Unlike constitutional law, with this famous methodological dispute in the 20s between Hans Kelsen on one side, Carl Schmitt and Ruffolsman on the other, there was no such dispute in administrative law. Mayer's concept maintained its dominance. Later, in the 30s, under the Nazi regimes, it was attacked because of its liberal constitutional foundation. But for this very reason, it made sense to return to Mayer after 1945. However, the impressive precision of the approach comes at the price of a strong reductionism. Important features that determine the reality of administration back then, and even more so today, have been totally ignored. 4 points made this particularly clear. First, in its organization, the administration is not a closed block. It is a pluriverse of different actors. Alongside the government and its subordinate authorities, there are corporations of municipal and functional self-government, independent agencies, and public enterprises. Administration does not only act unilaterally in sovereign forms, but also consensually through contracts, private law, or even informally. Administration, third point, is not limited to application of laws, but also as tasks of planning and political organization. Fourth, the application of law is not a substantial mechanism, but it rather includes different margins of evaluation on the part of the administration and of the courts for whose correct completion procedural questions also arise. As contemporary authors have already criticized, the legal method is by no means as neutral and purposeless as it claims to be. It is highly political because it focuses administrative law on the interest of the liberal middle classes while ignoring their social tasks. The administration of services, Leistungsverwaltung, and planning, Planungsverwaltung, which already existed in Meyer's time, especially at the municipal level, do not find an adequate place in the formal canon of his administrative law. It is beyond all doubt that in the Federal Republic after 1949, numerous important innovations were introduced into administrative law in an attempt to remedy these deficits. The course quickly made it clear that under the new German constitution, the individual was not in the status of subordination subject vis-à-vis the administration. The legislator created administrative procedural laws and strengthened the procedural side of administrative law, which Meyer had neglected. Ernst Forsthoff had already emphasized the importance of service administration in 1938, die Daseinvorsorge. Even if he did not succeed in systematically developing the law of service administration in his textbook on administrative law, which was influential in the Federal Republic of Germany, this administrative activity has long since been integrated into administrative law. The same applies to planning administration and its legal structuring. Informal administrative action has also found its place. Important academic discourses have developed the significance of organization, participation, and communication for administrative law. The program of new public administrative law science shows how all these expansions and innovations can be integrated into administrative law. In the meantime, real legal developments have caught up with and overtaken Otto Meyer's reductionist approach. Nevertheless, this concept continues to enjoy great popularity in courts, in bureaucratic work, in the public authorities, and in legal training in the universities. This is not without consequences. Meyer's approach still defines the rules. Anything different or new, to quote Peter Badura, is tainted with the odium of the exceptional character, odium des Ausnahmecharakters, and must bear the burden of proof for its legitimacy, a distortion, but influential. It is the same today. This is to be seen, for instance, in the subordinate role of the public contracts and the informal action of the administration have in contemporary administrative law. What is the reason for the unbroken fascination with Meyer's concept? Clear distinction and forms have a special appeal for lawyers. They correspond to a basic question of legal practice, lawful or unlawful. They accommodate the legalistic German legal culture, which is particularly focused on the judicial control of administration. Forms provide stability and thus serve legal certainty as an elementary value of the constitutional state and the rule of law. They reduce complexity and promise orientation. In this respect, it can be said that the classical model remains helpful. But here comes the caveat. Given the differentiated nature of the organization and tasks of the administration, legal certainty and orientation may only be provisional. This shows the ambivalence of classic administrative law. It is helpful, certainly, but only if it does not claim exclusivity and is open in its topics and methods. To this end, it is necessary to constantly review the traditional narratives. It is an excellent idea, therefore, that AIPDA has made precisely this text the central theme of its anniversary conference. Congratulations. So I can read.
Thank you. Yes, perfect. 28. And now Professor Medina on Spain.
Morning, everyone. Well, it's a real huge pleasure to be here for me. That's why my first words are to thank Associazione Italiana Professori di Diritto Amministrativo and its president, Professor Aldo Sandulli, the president of this wonderful panel, Professor Sabino Cassese, and the organizers. And thank you for counting on me and giving me the floor on a panel like this with several of the greatest masters of European administrative law. I assume this invitation as the most important recognition I have ever received because of my research on history of administrative law. I feel I have to say a bit of a member of your scientific community. I received my PhD from Bologna University, where I worked several years under the direction of Professor Vandelli. I see here his pupil, Professor Tubertini, my academic sister, I would say. And I would like to pay an emotional remembrance for Vandelli. And I keep scientific and personal contact with lots of you here, up to the extent that I see here professors that I saw the day of my wedding, just like Giuseppe Pipperata. Well, to know and to understand how administrative law was formed in Spain, Professor Kirk's difference between reality and perception framing this morning's session is very useful, I think. However, it drives me to a very different place. Let me explain. In Spain, as in UK, there was an enormous distance between one and the other, reality and the perception of it. But this huge distance was because of exactly opposite reasons. If administrative law existed in the UK, but Dicey and his followers were reluctant to accept it, in Spain, administrative law was perceived before it really existed. Moreover, it can be said that it was created thanks or through perception. The purpose of this lecture is actually to show how in Spain administrative law emerged in the 20s and 30s of the 19th century in the minds and writings of intellectuals. And that precisely for this reason, it can be said that administrative law was already a reality because it was perceived as existent. I will also draw a comparison which I find highly interesting between Dicey and Spanish dices. That is, those who in Spain rejected the administrative phenomenon, which were not few. They both had to deal with a reality that they did not like at all because of their liberal sensibility, but they dealt in very different ways. While Dicey chose to deny reality, pretending there was no administrative law, Gumersindo de Azcárate and others like him, Spanish dices, I would say, chose to accept it finally in order to modulate it and to make it administrative law a less special and more liberal branch. We can pass this slide. I don't know if I can do it. Okay, this is the general approach, what I want to show you. And we go to the next one. Okay. Before I start to talk, I would like to explain three grounds, bases, or premises of my research. I believe this is necessary so I can help to understand my reflection on administrative law. And I think it is necessary because the debate on reality and perception I think we have discrepancies which have to do with those grounds or premises. So I warn you right away, this is the way through which we can locate what are the differences of our views. My first premise, in my research, I do not start from an essential idea of administrative law in order to look for traces of it in the past. What I do is to verify that at a certain moment, intellectuals and politicians developed a concept, and from it, they have interpreted and shaped reality. It is very easy to trace precedents of each of the elements that make up what we now call administrative law: discretion, regulatory powers, takings, administrative procedure, governmental liability. But in order to rightly interpret these so-called precedents, the right thing to do, I think, is to start from the fundamental structures of knowledge of that time without contaminating ourselves with those of our time. And it happens that administration and administrative law are fundamental structures of knowledge from the 19th and 20th centuries. They were a brand new paradigm or episteme, if you let me use the well-known approaches of Thomas Kuhn and Michel Foucault. The prevailing paradigm until the French Revolution was another one. It was still the medieval paradigm of a jurisdictional monarchy, a pan-judicial vision according to which justice was the raison d'etre of the crown. If the king or his officials wanted to restrict the legal sphere of the vassals, they had to act like judges. They had to carry out an adversarial procedure and resolve it according to legal reasoning. Certainly, during the 17th and 18th centuries, as Tocqueville showed to all us, absolutist and despotic tendencies developed. Materials will then be predisposed with which the administration and administrative law will later be built. But the prevailing worldview continued to be jurisdictional. This has been proved in a very convincing way, I think, by a school of history of law developed in Southern Europe and Latin America. Among others, the Portuguese Antonio Manuel España, the Spaniards Bartolomé Clavero or Marta Lorente, the Italians Luca Manori and Bernardo Sordi here with us, who wrote a magnificent history of administrative law, and last but not least, the Argentinian Alejandro Agüero. Second ground or premise, and directly related to the previous one. The new administrative paradigm installed in Europe under the decisive French influence was just a piece, a fundamental one, but just a piece of a broader and more ambitious project, the construction of a state hegemonized by the administration, that is, an administrative state, a state dominated by a completely new authority called upon to perform many new duties. These were activities that no one carried out before or that were developed with difficulty by the variety of bodies of characteristic of the social structure of the ancien regime: guilds, church organizations, universities, or cities, which were not at all public power in the modern sense. This is the idea expressed by administrative lawyers of the early 19th century through the word centralization. With this, they did not talk like we do today about whether it or not it's better to distribute an already established power among public levels. They spoke of nationalizing, publicizing, assuming as governmental duties activities that until then did not exist or were private. Suffice is to say that protection of public order, the raison d'etre of the state itself, from the political liberalism perspective, was not a responsibility of the Spanish crown during the 18th century. This function began to be slowly nationalized, but only in Madrid and in the large cities. And I'm afraid Spain is not different on this point compared to other European experiences. If this is the case, in order to understand when and why administrative law emerged, it is necessary to closely follow the state-building process developed during the 19th century. If administrative law and administrative state-building process are handled as independent variables, if, for example, we look for administrative law in ancient Greece, the Roman Empire, the Middle Ages, or the modern state, we will be far away from understanding why, at a certain point, intellectuals, legislators, and judges throughout Europe felt the need to talk about administrative law. Third premise, equally connected to the previous ones. After World War II, administrative law has been seen as an essential tool for limiting power. But this is a modern perspective. This perspective was not the prevailing one during the 19th century. Administrative law emerged and developed as a fundamental tool to overcome the old culture of particularisms, procedures, and jurisdictional conflicts, a culture that hindered the construction of large infrastructures and the provision of public services. There is a culture that prevented the effective development of the new public responsibilities. In short, administrative law was a special branch of law without limits of natural law, mainly aimed at guaranteeing the superiority of the administration. Therefore, if we want to trace precedents of this administrative law, we shouldn't look to the old guarantees, that is, to the limits suffered by king's officials with respect to which administrative law was a reaction. We should seek in elements aiming to speed up the action of the king, such as the idea of police or the ministerial structure. Very important features, even though they did not transmute the jurisdictional paradigm into the administrative state. We go through the next slide, please. All right. I'm going to refer now to the key stages in the administrative state building process in Spain in order to contextualize the problem of the emergence of administrative law within them. To this end, I have prepared these slides so that you can properly locate each of these stages in time. The first period, we can go, next slide, all right, is the so-called Spanish Revolution. The Constitution of Cádiz of 1812 was at once Catholic and liberal, monarchical and radical. Effective in the context of an anti-liberal international order, it represents a very unique project of administration, halfway between the jurisdictional monarchy and the administrative state. I can't stop to tell the details, but I do bring you an eloquent one, and I do it through the next slide. Let's see. All right. In 1811, an official of the General Treasury of the Post Office, Luis Pereira de la Guardia, presented to the National Congress an essay on the science of good government. This work belongs to the old and long tradition of studies on the art of government. However, there are two very important new features. It promotes the liquidation of the corporate society through the suppression of guild privileges and the reduction of the power of the church and the nobility. And at the same time, the essay seeks the centralization, that is to say, nationalization of many duties, most of them managed until then by those bodies. The tool to do so was the creation of a Ministry of Government with provincial delegations, something which the National Congress will actually do in the near future. In reasoning his proposal, Luis Pereira did not hide that he was inspired by the experience of the enemy. Remember that at that time, the National Congress was leading the war of independence against the French invader. And that's what he's saying. I am the first enemy of Napoleon, but I think that what they're doing in France is to be used in Spain. Okay? So this work and others of the same kind are a link between the old studies on the art of government and the new science of administration, which will appear in Spain shortly afterwards. In any case, there is no trace here of an idea of administrative law. Moreover, at this time, it was assumed that all laws were civil or criminal. All these huge volumes of police regulations, which we had in Spain, were all considered civil or criminal. Those regulations relating the action of this new authority were of one kind or another. The emerging administration was actually subjected to the codification movement. Our Civil Code of 1821, projected Civil Code, actually considered the administration as such. Let's go to the next slide and to the second stage. The second stage is the restoration of the traditional monarchy. At this time, the word administration was already used extensively. experts in political economy and with political experience theorized the administration as a source of general welfare, as an antidote against revolution. Authors such as Javier de Burgos, José Canga Argüelles, or Pedro Sáenz de Andino founded the so-called science of administration in Spain, and they did so under the direct influence of the French scholar Charles Bonin, but with their own nuances. Law appears in these studies as a tool to build the administrative state. Their goal was not to explain and to systematize law. They were not writing as public lawyers. They were promoting the creation of an administration. They actually were not cultivating a science on administrative law, but science of administration, which is something different. However, these authors already distinguish between civil or judicial statutes and administrative statutes, leyes administrativas. If the former aim to protect and coordinate individual freedoms, the latter pursue the general interest and are to be applied by the administration. Administrative law is already here a paradigm, that is, an optic or window through which the old police statutes and the new proposals of administrative regulations were seen and examined. I will return to this idea, which is actually crucial for the purposes of this lecture. Let's go to the next slide. Next one. All right. The third stage is the first decade of the restored parliamentary monarchy. It is a fascinating period. The most revolutionary liberals, called progressive liberals, came to power. From there, they managed to win on the battlefield against the traditionalists, the ones who were fighting with arms to return to the ancien regime, that is, to a world without administration and with extensive local freedoms, the so-called Primera Guerra Carlista. These radical liberalists also managed to carry out a huge social reform that definitely liquidated the social structure on which the traditional monarchy had been built: appropriation and sale of church properties, elimination of nobility privileges, subjection to all territories to state law, with the abolition of many particularisms. At the same time, intellectuals and politicians belonging to the so-called conservative liberalism developed an extraordinary academic work. They designed in their books and articles the entire administrative state through a selective appropriation of pieces of the French model, adjusting them to their own interest. We have here centralization of administrative duties in the Ministry of Government, division of the territory into provinces with the state agent at the head of each, nationalization of city councils and universities, limitation of the personal responsibility of public officials by requiring prior administrative authorization to prosecute them, and we have, of course, the special justice for the administration, lo contencioso administrativo, following the Napoleonic model. But they were proposals. They were not installed already. At this time, the science of administrative law burst in. The government created the first chair on the subject. They were occupied by Tomás María Bizmanos and José Posada Herrera, who published important treatises. We can see them in the following slide. Let's see. All right. These works and others of the same kind present administrative law as an unexplored field which is yet to be plowed, but a field as such, pre-existing and susceptible to systematic ordering. Although only some of those reforms were carried out, in fact, this enormous intellectual activity was decisive. The paradigm of administrative law was completely established, and this had two important consequences. First, legislation from another legal world, where there was not even administration, will come to be seen as administrative law, thus taking a whole new meaning. And second, by presenting administrative law as a pre-existing reality, disordered and unexplored, but a pre-existing reality, those intellectuals managed to legitimize their proposals for the construction of the administrative state, which in fact will not take long to be established. And we see an example of what I'm saying in the next slide, please. Next slide. All right. Here we have Tomás María Bitmanos. He was professor, the first professor of our subject in the engineering school, where he is telling us that administrative law exists, but it's completely disordered. And he will try to explore it for the first time. Yep. And he's also proposing many reforms. So administrative law was perceived before it was true. But that perception had almost a thaumaturgical effect. The perception of reality created and shaped reality itself. Those old police statutes became something new, even though they did not change initially. Let's go to the following and to the following. All right. In fact, okay, we're going to stay here. Okay. During the following stage, the conservative governments would in fact rely on the social reform of the previous progressist governments to develop the aforementioned project of an administrative state. The most significant expression of this trend was the treatise on administrative law by Manuel Colmeiro. Now we can go to the next slide. Colmeiro was a professor at my university, already state university, and he wrote the next one. Yeah, he wrote this important book on administrative law. The first edition is of 1850. And every single lawyer and politician during the second half of the 19th century were educated through this book in the new administrative culture. A book, by the way, that would influence some French authors, such as Anselme Bacpi, and that would be used for the construction of the new Latin American states. Actually, it was published not only in Spain, but also in Latin America, Peru. For the purposes of this session, it is interesting to note that during this time, meanwhile, the administration is appearing as a strong power, a political and intellectual movement against the administrative state was consolidated. We have, on the one hand, monarchical traditionalism in favor to a return to the ancien régime, and on the other, the individualistic or progressive liberalism in favor of the minimal state. Both agreed on the fundamentals. They contested nationalization of municipalities and the extensive administrative activity. They promoted the abolition of the contencioso administrativo, the justice for the administration, as well as they promoted a broad personal responsibility of every single officer, not short-circuited by prior administrative authorization. Next slide, please. The aforementioned Gumersindo de Azcárate would sustain a strong position against administrative law in Spain that was substantially identical to the one that Dicey would later develop with respect to France. With regard to prior authorization and administrative justice, their remarks were exactly the same, and you can read them in the slide you have there. Well, next slide. This movement will make their revolution for a short period of time. Next slide. Although this, next slide. All right. Although this will have consequences, many, it did not prevent the consolidation of the administrative state. In fact, during the last of the stages we were taking into account, the one which you can check in the slide, state control of the territory and administrative action was extensive thanks to communications, among other factors. The reality of administration and administrative law was so evident and overwhelming that the traditionalist and the individualist, once the revolutionary attempt had failed, understood that there was no choice but to work within that reality in order to transform it. Instead of opposing administrative law, they worked with it and within it to build a less centralized state with more individual guarantees. Let me give you 3 significant examples. Next slide, please. The aforementioned Spanish Dicey, Gumersindo de Azcárate,
promoted as a member of parliament the first general codification of administrative procedure in the world, Ley de Bases de Procedimiento Administrativo, approved in 1889, much earlier than the famous Austrian laws of 1925, as Professor de la Cananea is well aware. The Spanish Dicey, unlike Dicey, ended up changing his attitude towards administrative law. He first contested it, and afterwards he promoted those guarantees because of his liberal approach, transforming administrative law in a more power-oriented branch of law. And here you can see the proposal he wrote that was actually approved by the National Congress. Second example, a close friend of Gumersindo, also professor at my university, and also deputy of the National Congress, Vicente Santa Maria de Paredes, belonging to the same liberal school of thought, what he achieved in 1888, the partial judicialization of administrative justice. Justice served to citizens claiming against administrative powers began to resemble a bit the ones served among individuals. And here you have the famous among us Ley Santa Maria de Paredes concerning administrative justice of 1888. Third and last example, other professors linked to the same school of thought, like Adolfo Posada, promoted in their writings the direct liability of the state for wrongs of civil servants. The old personal responsibility of public officers coming from the Ancien regime was enough guarantee in a world without administration or with little administration. But at the end of the 19th century, when the administration was already intervening extensively, it was absolutely insufficient. In this situation, these authors, instead of insisting on criticizing the extension of administrative activity or the existence of this authorization to prosecute civil officers, they will promote this brand new governmental liability. Conclusions. Let's go to the next slide, which is the last one. From all that has been said, two conclusions can be drawn, and I would add an additional one. First conclusion. In Spain, administrative law was born at the beginning of the 19th century in the minds and writings of authors who identified the paradigm of the new times. It can be said that since then there was an administrative law because the old police regulations began to be interpreted as administrative law, and because this new perception will drive the reforms that will indeed shape the administration, guaranteeing it a position of superiority. Second conclusion, in Spain, there were important authors who, like Dicey, opposed administrative law, contesting its indeed genuine authoritarian approach. However, at the end of the 19th century, the reality of administration was so unavoidable that they had no choice but to accept it. So those who had challenged the construction of this special branch of law ended up working within it to make it more liberal and less special. In developing these ideas, I have made remarks on some specific institutions such as administrative procedure and governmental liability. This allows me to make a final remark or conclusion useful to underpin my methodological grounds or premises, a place where I believe some fundamental discrepancies with my illustrious colleagues can be situated. Let me explain. In Spain, as in Europe, most of the administrative lawyers still think that if during the 19th century there was a lack of a culture of administrative procedure or a lack of a culture of state liability, it was the fault of the absolutism of the Ancien regime. They think that the absence of these guarantees was a legacy of the past, that the administrative law did not initially manage to overcome or sideline. This vision is closely linked to two caricatures of misconceptions. The one of the traditional monarchy as a huge and unlimited state, which is proved to be a false view carried out by 19th century historians in order to hide the fact that the so-called liberal state was in fact a project of a huge state dominated by a whole new authority, which is the administration. And the second misconception or caricature, for example, is that administrative law served to limit power, which in fact is the opposite, served to create and give power to the new authority, which we call administration. Well, this second caricature served, for example, a brilliant professor such as García Rentería to legitimize the construction of a guarantee-based administrative law in the midst of a dictatorship. Well, a research not contaminated by these historiographical discourses yields the following conclusion. It was precisely administrative law the one which intentionally denied, abhorred the administrative procedure, since its purpose was to guarantee expeditious public action without the obstacles of the jurisdictionalist culture of the Ancien Regime. And it was also administrative law, the one that, in order to privilege the administration and its extensive action, made it difficult for the new governmental liability proposed by liberals to establish and consolidate. Today, administrative procedure and state liability are a reality. If we insist on looking for its precedence in the Ancien Regime, we might get something. It might be useful. But we risk to lose sight of the fact that its initial negation and its subsequent affirmation are phenomena of the 19th and 20th centuries closely linked to the administrative state building process. Thank you very much for your attention.
Mario, the floor is yours. Where do you want to sit, here or stand here? I don't know. Autorità sovrana.
Dear colleagues, I organized my conclusions on this session in 3 concise parts. I will start focusing on a number of issues on which until the recent past there was a broad consensus. Then I will examine the profound changes that have taken place over the last 2 decades, and at the end, I will see what can be foreseen for the future of our discipline. Given the short time available, it's late now, I must be inevitably assertive, and I am sorry for this. About the first part, I have selected 5 features of administrative law widely shared in our scientific committee until the beginning of this century. First, the 19th century was the golden age of administrative law, but in a correct historical perspective, as demonstrated by the thoughtful papers presented this morning, administrative law has ancient roots back in some jurisdiction to the 16th century. Both in jurisdictions where modern unitary states were being formed, as France and England, and in polycentric systems that only many centuries later were unified as Germany or Italy. As the papers and other recent researches have shown, the oldest experiences were not preliminary stages of modest significance, but seminal cases for subsequent, more effective developments. Second, administrative law is the branch of law most closely related to the modern state, more precisely to the nation state, but not necessarily. Since the 50s of last century, under the treaty establishing the European Community, administrative law is no more an affair of state sovereignty, to quote Maurice Rio. For a long period, administrative law was very diverse because it was marked by the political, legal, and cultural traditions of different European systems, the specificities of each country, which in my view are a wealth of our continent, the richness of our continent. Third, jurisprudence and scholarship have played a crucial role in the formation of administrative law. Since the beginning of the 19th century, the role of legislation has been increasing, both for the development of general part and above all for the specialized branches such as social law, planning law, environmental law, and so on. Despite the diversities just mentioned, it is possible to identify a common core of general principle of administrative law, as shown by researchers of Conceal and Jacinto de la Canadera, of course. Fourth, administrative law of the 19th century was initially characterized as an instrument of the prince to effectively implement the task deliberated by the public power. But soon it also became the shield of the rights of the individuals vis-à-vis public power. Individuals were no longer the administrator, but full citizens. Over time, since the end of the 19th century, the functions of administrative law have multiplied, going far beyond the traditional bipolarity, public power, freedom of the citizens. Administrative law has become multifunctional. It can serve different purposes. Fifth, in the many European jurisdictions, there has been the phenomenon called constitutionalization of administrative law. This has meant the strengthening of the principle of legality and other general principles, the protection of fundamental rights, the guarantee of effective judicial review, and the broadening of the role of the constitutional courts. This phenomenon has also occurred in European law, especially under the Lisbon Treaty and the Charter of Fundamental Rights. This is why, still today, in my view, seems appropriate the expression of the German jurist Fritz Werner of administrative law as constitutional law made concrete, made real. But, and this is the second part, over the last 2 decades, strong developments have taken place. Administrative law appeared to be in great difficulty. Some jurists talk of an escape from administrative law. I am thinking of a trend to limit the scope and forms of public intervention, the retrenchment of the Administrative Act with the concomitant spread of consensual forms of action, and the large use of private law, the privatization, the downsizing of the state, and so on. However, we are living in times of extraordinary change, when nothing can be taken for granted or irreversible. Think of 2 major issues: the apparent decline of the state and the globalization. Everything comes back into question. The influence of these changes on public law, and in particular on administrative law, is evident, it's clear. For reasons of brevity, I have chosen 3 issues that I consider central, exemplary. The issue usually referred to beyond the state, the issue of supranationality, and the issue of how administrative law is evolving. In my view, the state is back at the center of the political and legal arena. Certainly, the present state, the new state, is very different from that of the tradition. Borders can be changed by peaceful agreement, but also by violence, unfortunately. The population changes significantly through migration. The idea of nation state leaves more space for republican state. The unitary state has given way to multiple forms of devolution and institutional pluralism. and also more room for individuals and social entities. State sovereignty has given way to original forms of shared sovereignty, as in the European Union, or of cooperative sovereignty, as in some international organizations. However, despite the many innovations, the state remains central, taking control also of new roles. At present, the perspective of beyond the state does not appear to me legally and politically correct. For sure, to be clear, I'm not obsessed with the myth of the state, nor I am a follower of Carl Schmitt or similar great jurists. But as a jurist, I must acknowledge that today, and at least today, not perhaps tomorrow, the situation is as shown. Natalino Irdi, a leading Italian jurist, has described this phenomenon in a literary expression, perhaps Manzonian, as Manzoni. It is the time of historical, financial, social, and health crisis, when individuals realize that they are alone and look up to the state with an almost pleading feeling. Individuals and businesses seek refuge in the traditional structures of coexistence. What can the state do but help? This is a quotation by it. The second issue chosen to ground my view, the current state of supranationality. In my view, confirms what I have now said about the state. For decades, I tried to make my small contribution to the development of the European legal integration and to the internationalization of our discipline. But I must take note that the constitutional momentum of European integration has run out, at least according to the traditional community method of Europe, gentle force, that had worked so well for a long time. Now, the real driving force of integration is in Article 15, the European Council, which according to that article shall provide the Union with the necessary impetus for its development and shall define the general political direction and priorities. An original compromise, which is given an effective and positive course for integration progress. The Union, in my view, has reached the highest possible point of integration a few years ago. It can go further only if the general political conditions change. The project that involved us so much, integration through law, I remember the late 70s, last century, has no further chance to success for the time being. The process of European integration cannot be left to law and jurists. It is primarily a political process, boosted by national polities with their specificities and traditions, a glorious historical legacy of our continent. The current blockade of European constitutional law is counterbalanced by European administrative law, which is constantly evolving, profound in scope and quality of new solutions. While waiting for a general clarification of the Union's constitutional governance, European administrative law embodies one of the cornerstones since the founding period of the European Community. The one expressed vividly in the preamble of the treaty, still and called Treaty of 1951, according to which aware that Europe will be built only by concrete implementations that create a de facto solidarity and by the establishment of common foundation for economic development. European administrative law can continue its integrative dynamic and asymmetry with the institutional blockade of the Union. Also, at international level. Hundreds of organizations are returning to the original model of administrative unions, where states strictly maintain the last say, the competence. This is evident even in the latest generation of organizations, such as WTO, that were approaching models of integration close to supranationality. The current case of tariffs is exemplary in demonstrating the crisis of this model. With regard to the ways of development of administrative law, prophecies about overcoming the traditional mode of administrative law by leaps and bounds, with the end of the political contrast, the end of politics, of violence and wars, seem far away in the current conditions. Things have been different from the ideal world order designed by Henry Kissinger in his famous book of 2014, grounded in the best Western culture, to the today's great disorder. After the short 20th century of Eric Hobsbawm, new ideologies are returning. Violence is rampant. In this great turmoil, administrative law retains an essential role as the main legal instrument for implementing public policies in a multiple functional way, and as in the tradition for protecting individuals against abuses of power. In my view, administrative law is not the expression of a particular historical moment, but a structural element of a public power in which the centrality of public administration in satisfying the essential needs of the individual and the community remains very firm. In short, and going to the end, administrative law does not seem to be at the end of this parabola. Some of its characteristics have changed, but it is an evolution, not a crisis, an evolution typical of vital discipline. It is curious that the part of European legal science that intends to cut off once for all the binomial administrative law state complains what seems to be the main result of this break, the loss of legitimacy that public administration had in the state. When, on the other hand, the task of legal science is to find, if possible, new forms of legitimacy. For instance, in the framework of the European Union, I believe that the Charter of Fundamental Rights and the Treaty on Functioning have secured a solid constitutional parameter for the European public administration and its law, as well as a secure legitimacy checked by the Court of Justice at the end of all. I conclude these remarks raising a question, so not a conclusion, but a possible new debate, a discussion for possible developments of our discipline. I've been using the traditional verbal expression administrative law, but given the historical experiences, the profound recent evolutions, and the multiple features assumed by public administration, is still possible to have a coherent notion of the administrative law today. In brief, the substance underlying the notion of administrative law is still keeping a consistent unitary meaning. For me, this is the question.
Thank you. Lunch break. We will meet again at 2:30 sharp.